the field that you're in is a great field. I mean, I'm as enthusiastic about this field today as I was 35, 40 years ago. Second of all, the power of a longitudinal study. We are involved with a number of longitudinal studies at the University of Cincinnati, some which started here at the University of Utah and went with us when I went to the university. Longitudinal studies are extremely powerful, and what I'm going to do is review with you today a longitudinal study that started when I was a graduate student in Cincinnati in 1980, carried with me when I came to the University of Utah in around 80, and then went back to me at the University of Cincinnati in 1986, and how that study has really driven public health policy in regard to setting environmental exposure standards for a particular thing we were studying. And the third thing is you can make a difference from a public health perspective. So be persistent, stay with it, and follow it forward, and you really can make an impact on what's going on. So what this story is about is a 30-year study of workers exposed to vermiculite and how that has driven public health policy. And I picked this topic because it's a Western topic. Libby Vermiculite from Libby, Montana. W.R. Grace is the company that mined it up to 1990 when they shut the mine down. And it really is an occupational environmental hazard that has spread throughout the United States. The original study that we got involved with was in Ohio when I was a graduate student. And I have a picture. I have changed over time. I actually had my hair frizzed back in 1980. I looked a little different then than I did now. I was sort of out there. Anyway, the original part of the study was funded by Scott Fertilizer Company. So they funded the university. That's how it got started in 1980. And then subsequent funding came through the CDC as well as Region 8 of the EPA, which is the Rocky Mountain region for the Environmental Protection Agency. So what is vermiculite? It's a micaceous mineral. It expands up to 20 times its original size when heated, so it blows up like popcorn. It's used as an insulation and an absorbent material, different type of industries, including home insulation. And it really does numerous residential and commercial applications in the United States. You put it in cement, it'll make the cement lighter and give it insulating properties. It's used in animal feed as a filler. Okay, it's used in home insulation. The primary sources in the US was Libby, Montana, up to 1990 when the mine finally was shut down. Other sources in the US they come from South Africa, and there's a source in South Carolina and a source in Virginia that are still active. So this is Libby, Montana. It absolutely is gorgeous. This is a great trout fishing stream if you're interested in trout fishing. These are three of my colleagues. They're all chest radiologists that helped in some of the studies. And this is courtesy of Chris Myers, who's currently at the University of Wisconsin. There's a book that's been published about Libby, Montana by Andrew Schneider. Andrew won a Pulitzer Prize, and he really brought out in a public forum the problems in Libby, Montana. And the title of the book is An Air That Kills. And if you have a chance, it's a worthwhile read, because it really goes through how this particular company, for a long time, suppressed information about what was going on at this particular mine source. So this is the mine source in Libby, Montana. It's an open pit mine. And this is what the massive part of the ore looks like. It's a very micaceous material, and this white part of the ore is I don't want to say it's contamination. It's a mineral source that goes along with the micaceous vermiculite. If you know mineralogy is very rare to have a pure ore source. It's usually a combination of other things that come into the ore source. And this happened to be an asbestos-formed mineral that was not regulated. It didn't fall under the OSHA criteria for regulation. If you look at pure vermiculite, it's a very micaceous-like material. And what happens, it has a high water content. And when you heat it, the water turns to steam, and it blows up like popcorn, or vermicular configuration. Vermicular is Greek for You'll recognize it if you look at this picture. This is what blown up vermiculite looks like. Most of you recognize it from a soil additive, okay? And if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you'll see vermiculite in bags. It's not from Libby, Montana, it's another ore source, either from Virginia or South Africa or the Carolinas. And this is a very good insulator. And in some of the older homes in the US, it's in the walls, it's in the ceiling. When I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, above my bedroom, the roof was insulated with vermiculite. And as a kid, I used to go up there and play in this stuff, all right? So if I ever get a mesothelioma, you have the documentation about that. Okay, so Libby vermiculite contains up to 26% asbestos foreign minerals. And actually, the research, initial research that was done on this was done when I was here at the University of Utah using the VA that had electron microscopy at that time. And we identified that, in fact, there was asbestos foreign minerals in Libby vermiculite, but they did not fall under the OSHA regulatory commercial criteria for asbestos. What they contained was amphibole fibers, winzite, richterite, and there was some tremolite. But the main two were winzite and richterite, and these were not regulated, okay? So it didn't fall under the OSHA criteria at that time. From Libby, the ore was shipped to over 250 regional processing facilities, and we call these expanding facilities. And up to 80% of the world's supply came from Libby, Montana. So it was a huge ore source. They shipped it in a micaceous form, and it went to regional expander plants, and what they would do is these expander plants were 4 stories tall, and they had gas jets in them, and they would dump the raw ore in the top. It would run through baffles and be heated, and by the time it got to the bottom, it would be blown up like popcorn. So it was not economically feasible for them. They had to ship it they couldn't ship it in expanded form. They had to ship it in unexpanded form. Oh. Okay, that was a cartoon slide that they couldn't transfer out. So these are the expander plants throughout the United States, and you can see there's one right there. So when I was out here as a faculty member starting late 1980, the outer part of 1980, I go trotting down to next to the Denver Rio Grande station in Salt Lake City, about a block away, and there's a whole block that's fenced off, and in the middle of that block is a big expander plant. And I went in and said, can I have a sample of this ore? And they said, fine, take it. I took unexpanded samples, and I took expanded samples and took it to VA, okay? The dust on the floor of that expander plant was about 6 inches. So it was a heavily contaminated area. But you can see that they're all over the United States, and over 2,000 shipments are where the big red circles are. And one of the main areas is right there, and that's Marysville, Ohio, and that's the location of W.R. Scott Company, the fertilizer company, okay? And what is they get the raw ore, they had expander plants there, they expand it, and then they would put fertilizers and herbicides on the micaceous plains of the expanded ore, and they use it as a carrier, so when you put it on your lawn, it could be spread out in your lawn, okay? So what's the problem with Libby vermiculite? Well, the problem is this. In the back, you can see the micaceous plains here, here, here. But this is the contamination. And if you know what asbestos amphiboles look like, this is what it looks like. It's long, it's thin, it's crystalline, and when it cleaves along its longitudinal plane. It doesn't get shorter, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And if you inhale just one of these fibers, eventually they'll break out into thinner and thinner fibers in your lungs. So if you inhale and your dose is 1 fiber, 10 years later it might be 10 fibers because of how it cleaves. It cleaves along its longitudinal plane and gets thinner and thinner. If I took an ion probe and went down one of these fibers, they're very complex. It may be richterite here, depending on its chemical composition. As I go down, it may be windsite. As I go down further, it may be tremolite. All right, so the chemical composition changes depending on what part of the fiber you look at. Okay, so we started in 1980, and I did this as a grad student. This was my master's thesis. Okay, it was sponsored by W.R. Scott. They were concerned because people in their workforce were developing bloody pleural effusions, and they didn't know why. So they turned to the University of Cincinnati. When I showed up as a graduate student, Stu Brooks, who was my mentor, said, "Guess what? I got a project for you." And that was my project. So that's how I got into this field from a research perspective. And then we followed them up again in 2004 through the CDC, and this is 2010 through Region 8. And then we have another study that I'll show you. So originally we did exposure reconstruction, which was mainly me, who went back through all this industrial hygiene data. We did occupational histories, pulmonary questionnaires, spirometry, diffusion tests, and chest x-rays. In 2004, we repeated the spirometry and the chest x-rays. We added a mortality study in 2004. In 2010, we did another exposure reconstruction where we actually had additional records that O.M. Scott gave us that they didn't have originally. And I had Dr. Cal Rice, who is a very good industrial hygienist, works at the University of Cincinnati, lead that part of the study for us. We repeated the occupational histories, pulmonary function, spirometry, diffusion, chest x-rays. We're continuing with the mortality study part of it. And then we did HRCTs, which is a more sensitive test to look at the chest rather than a chest x-ray. And we also drew biological samples because there's some indication that this particular ore source is associated with autoimmune disease, systemic lupus erythematosus, and rheumatoid arthritis. So the Marysville is a regional processing facility. W.R. Scott made lawn care products, and they expanded Libby Vermiculite from 1959 to 1980. In 1980, when we arrived, we did analysis of the ore, and we said, you need to stop using this ore, you need to switch to another ore source. And it all started because of a cluster of 12 workers over a 5-year period of time who developed bloody pleural effusions, meaning they were developing fluid between their chest wall and their lung, and when you put a needle in, pull it out, it was bloody. It looked like a bloody pleural effusion. And this was actually by Dr. Pryor at Ohio State University. He's the one who identified these cases originally. In 1980, then we did a cross-sectional study, and we followed up in 2004, and then later on I'll show you the most recent results. But in 1980, we only had 2% of the workers had X-ray abnormalities. And that's sort of background for what we call pleural along the wall. Pleural plaques is a marker of asbestos exposure, and only 2% of these workers had those types of changes. But what was significant, it was a dose-response relationship. It wasn't uniformly spread out among the population. The people that had the higher exposure, more likely than not, had these changes. So that article was published in the American Review of Respiratory Disease, and we identified it as a health hazard that needed to be followed. We went back in 2004 and did a follow-up study. Now, exposure to this ore ceased in 1980, stopped in 1980. And in 2004, the localized pleural thickening had increased to 24% with no further exposure. And now we are starting to see scarring within the lung itself. We call that interstitial changes, similar to pulmonary asbestosis. And we also continue to see a significant association between cumulative exposure and pleural changes. And we're seeing that in 20% of the workers who had a lifetime cumulative exposure to this particular fiber of less than 2.21 fiber cc years. So what's a fiber cc year? If I'm exposed to 1 fiber per cc of air for a 40-hour work week for a normal work year, that's 1 fiber cc year. If I work in that environment for 20 years, it's a 20 fiber cc year. If I'm exposed to 5 fibers per cc over 1 year, and I work for 5 years, it's 5 times 5, or 25 fiber cc years. Same as what we use in pack years. Same concept. Marysville, Ohio. Honda manufactures their automobiles in Marysville. It's a fantastic community. This is the O.M. Scott campus. It is absolutely gorgeous. You notice there's no dandelions any place on that picture. And this is what the plant site looks like. And this is what? This is the expander part of the plant site. The ore goes to the top out of silos. It's dumped in here, it comes down, it's heated and expands, it blows up like popcorn, okay? So the most recent study we did in this was 2011, and we did everything. We repeated the occupational pulmonary histories, lung function, chest x-rays, we added HRCT scans, we added a mortality study to it, and we drew biological samples for doing autoimmune testing in this population. Okay, so what we were looking at, this is an example of actually a worker from Libby, Montana, and initially this chest x-ray is normal. What I want you to look at, this is the lungs, rib cage, the heart's here, the abdominal cavity, this is the diaphragm. Just keep an eye on this area right there. This is some 17 years later, and you notice the diaphragm now sort of has this volcanic type cap on it. This is a calcified pleural plaque. That's an early indicator of a fiber-related pulmonary disease. And then this is the same person 35 years after his initial exposure. Now you can't see the diaphragm. He has massive thickening along the left side of the chest wall. Okay, this is an exposure for this worker that also ceased around 1982 from the Libby mine. So it's a progressive disease. You inhale the fibers, your lung can't clear them, they don't dissolve, they're there forever, and eventually you'll end up causing fibrosis either involving the pleural membrane or the lung itself. It can be much more severe. This is a person that has fibrosis in the lung itself, and you see this white strip along the side, that's massive calcification. So this person has a very disabling disease. And this is what it looks like if you take different angles. You can see the calcification along here. You can't see the lung bases, they're obliterated. There's calcification along here. It's a very progressive disease in workers. It's not you stop exposure and you look at the worker 20 years later and there's going to be abnormalities in a significant portion of them. Okay, so I'm going to go on. This is an example, next slide, right here. And this is an example that was published by Dr. Wright et al. And this is somebody who worked in a local expander plant in Los Angeles for one summer. And this is what happened to him 50 years later. Certainly taken short before his death, he had massive fibrosis in his lung. So a relatively short-term exposure can cause disease in this. And this is what it looks like on an HRCT scan for the physicians in the audience. There's fibrosis in the bases and there's pleural thickening on both sides. So it is something that's difficult to ignore when you see it clinically. Okay, so we went back then in 2011 and 2010, 2011, and we updated the cumulative exposure levels for each worker. The reason we updated it and didn't use the data that I developed originally in 1980 was there was new records available, and I had additional support to bring in some very good industrial hygienists who could go back in time and do exposure reconstruction. I mean, that's a real art to be able to do that, go back through records and come up with an exposure matrix over time for workers depending on their job position, when they worked there, what ore is being shipped in the facility, and actual sampling records. So in 19 1980, when I was a grad student, there were 325 records that were available. And what we did was we found an additional 600 records. So we had a lot more records available to review. And we reviewed 3,100 pages. And we also went back to the plant site and put together focus groups. In other words, we went back and said, we need some old workers who have been here for 35 years. We're going to sit down with you, and we want you to describe what was it like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? It's a real art to be able to do that. I'm not an expert in that, but I'm smart enough to know that there are some very good industrial hygienists out there that have experience in doing that and do a great job at it. And with this, we were able to really expand the exposure matrix in this particular population. And that's important because the EPA then eventually came and obtained our database and felt that the exposure matrix that was reconstruction was so rigorous that they could use it to set standards. And this is the result of that reconstruction. And I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but trionizing is what O.M. Scott called the expander process at their facility. They call it trionizing. That's where the expanders were. And then this is a fitted curve. It's logarithmic. And you can see that in the earlier years prior to 1980, the exposure levels were relatively high, and this is a log scale, but they're around 6 to 8 fibers per cc. And then they started to drop, and you can see the sampling really started around 1972 is when we had sampling. And so we extrapolated back based on what the sampling was originally and what ore source was being shipped to the plant and where it was coming from and how many shipments were received, because we had those type of records. So we had initial sampling results from 1972. Before that, we had to go back and extrapolate to what the sampling was before that. And you can see it started this drop in 72, and it really dropped around 1980 when we arrived. And then after that, it was relatively constant. And this is how we fitted the curve to all those results available. We also calculated yearly geometric means. So what did we see? And this is part of having good exposure data. You don't get misclassifications when you look at the human outcomes. It's always a problem when you have limited data. You start to see health misclassifications. It doesn't quite make sense. One of the things we look at in longitudinal studies, does the data make sense? So what I would think here is, with time and with increased exposures, we should see increasing disease. And it should be in an exposure response relationship. So in this particular population, this is Marysville study. This is prevalence in unadjusted risk factors for pleural changes based on HRCT scan by cumulative fiber exposure and employment duration. But we'll just look at cumulative fiber exposure here initially. This is the cumulative fiber exposure is in fiber cc years, and this is less than 0.15 fiber cc years. That means about a month. And we use that as our reference population, okay? This is 0.15 to less than 0.45. That's about a half a year. 0.45 to 1.35, that's about a year. 1.35 to less than 10 and greater than 10. And so, and this is the number of subjects we had this in this population, and we used the lowest exposure group as our reference population. And even in that population, the prevalence of pleural changes, even though there were only 4, was almost 9%, which is probably a little high. Because in the background population in the US, it's around 2%. At the next matrix, it went to 22%, or numbers 22 or 44%, and then 60%, 92%, and around 88%. So there's a true dose-response relationship. The bigger the dose, the more likely you're going to see an adverse health outcome. But the significant thing, what's the OSHA standard for asbestos? 0.1 fiber per cc. Okay, 0.1 fiber per cc. In this population, these results are way under that standard. Okay. If you look at the unadjusted relative risks, and why are they unadjusted? Why didn't we adjust for it? For smoking, for age? There's no other risk factor for pleural plaques other than some other minerals than or asbestos-formed mineral. We don't have to adjust it for age. We don't have to adjust it for smoking. We don't have to adjust it for gender, okay, or race. There's no other adjustment to put in it. I guess why it's unadjusted. And you can see that the unadjusted relative risk is 5, 6.8, 10, and 10 again. And the confidence intervals are all above 1. So that is a very strong exposure-response relationship. And that is the type of data that the EBA can take then and formulate what they call iris level or RFC value. Duration is not as critical as this, but we saw also a duration-response relationship with the same thing. The longer you work in this particular profession with this particular exposure, the more likely you're going to see an adverse health outcome. Here, the relative risk is 3.4. It increases 6 to 9 years, 5.5, and greater than 9 years, 8.1. So would we expect that with this particular exposure? The answer is yes. We would expect that to happen. So now we look at unadjusted risk factors by cumulative exposure and employment duration for late hires after 1972. Why did we do that? Well, remember the industrial hygiene data? We only started to get industrial hygiene data in 1972. Okay, so one of the internal checks we did is, well, maybe we were really screwed up with the dose reconstruction back in before 1972. We didn't have data, right? So maybe we misclassified everybody and we overestimated everything, and it's just bull. So we did an internal check. We're just going to look at the data we really had from 72 on and see if we see the same dose-response relationship. And in fact, we see the same type of phenomena. With increasing dose, you tend to see increasing abnormalities, 37, 40, and 92%. Right? So that was sort of an internal check to us that we were doing what we should have done, that our data was really good, that the IH data, we had a lot of confidence in the exposure data. So then we went on. Well, some people could say pleural changes in themselves are just markers of exposure. They're not really a disease. They don't really have a big impact on your lung function. And to a certain extent, that's true. If you have a pleural plaque, an isolated pleural plaque, you're not going to know you even have it. But these pleural plaques don't just tend to be an isolated. They tend to have more and more over time, and as you get more and more, they can impact your lung function, and they can progress to other things occurring in your lung. So we looked at parenchymal changes, and by parenchymal changes, we're talking about fibrosis in the lung itself. And here we had to adjust. There's different things that will affect parenchymal changes: cigarette smoking, age. As we get older, it can just occur from other disease states such as autoimmune disease or hypersensitivity pneumonitis or things along those lines. And we tend to see the same phenomena here. We don't see as many, but with increasing dose, it goes from the reference population was 4.2%, 16%, 28%, at 1.35 to less than 10 fiber cc years, and then 24% at the greatest. And we didn't have a huge population for duration, but those people that had the highest duration tend to have the most interstitial fibrosis changes in the lung. And these are disabling changes. They are progressive in time, and you can actually die from that type of change. So then the next question we said, well, most people say pleural plaques are not related to loss in lung function. It's a marker of exposure. Okay, if you look in the literature, and it's sort of all over the ballpark. So we went back and looked at actual how well is a person breathing, and if they have an isolated pleural plaque, just thickening along the inside of the chest wall, are they going to have problems with their lung function? So this is those results, and this is percent predicted forced vital capacity. What that is, if you take a deep breath and blow under a spirometer, how much air do you have in your lung in total? That's forced vital capacity. And FEV1, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, is when you blow into that spirometer, how much blows out in the first second. So we measure how much blows out in the first second and how much is in your lung in total. And the way we divided this is we looked at people who just had localized pleural only. Okay? That's all they had, just an isolated pleural plaque. And we had, in this population, there was 126. 61 of these people had localized pleural thickening only versus the other 65 that had nothing on their chest x-ray. It was normal, okay? And we found in that population, after adjusting for everything that can cause loss in lung function, including age, cigarette smoking, weight, smoking when being raised in a smoking family, race can have an impact on, there's a whole host of things that affect your pulmonary function test. We found that, in fact, the percent predicted loss for FVC was 6.1, and for FEV1 was 4.3. And as we went down into the severity, as we looked at people that had more severe lung changes, we would expect greater loss, correct? And that's what we found. So in the FVC, for those people that had more changes on their chest x-ray, the loss was 8%. And for people that had interstitial changes or diffuse pleural thickening, a lot of fibrosis in the lung, it was 18%. So again, we're seeing a correlation between loss in lung function and what we see on the chest x-ray, which is what we should see if we have a pretty good data set. Okay. So the question is a loss of 6.1% clinically significant? You know, each of us has to answer that question. If I start out at 100% predicted lung function, in other words, I compare my results to somebody who's 6'2", who's 71 years old, who's a Caucasian male, right, who's a never smoker. And I had this exposure. I lost 6.1% of my lung function. I'm probably not going to notice that, okay? But if you put that on top of somebody who's also a cigarette smoker, or somebody who's lived in a high air pollution environment, or somebody who's been raised in a smoking family, mother and father smoke when they're being raised, because we know if you're raised in a smoking family, your lung function is going to be impaired. No question about that. Maybe that 6.1% is the thing that pushes that person over from no impairment to mild impairment, or mild impairment to moderate impairment, okay? It's not clear. I mean, everybody has to make their own decision about that, whether this is clinically significant or not. In certain circumstances, it will be. In other circumstances, it may not be. Okay, so if we look at percent pleural changes over time, in 1980, we started with 2%. And again, exposure ceased in 1980, okay? In 2004, there was 80 out of 280 that had pleural changes. And in 2010, it was 91 over 305. So it increased a little bit from 2004 to 2010. And this is based on chest x-rays. Chest x-rays, okay. So if you go to a more sensitive technique, HRCT scan, which is like taking a sort of a microscope to your lung, if we looked at that data, what happened in 2010, rather than being 91 out of 305, we only had HRCT scans on 191, but 101 of those were positive, so now it's over 50% by using a more sensitive technique. Okay. So we're going to compare this then. Well, what's going on in the non-asbestos family that had fiber exposure? Anybody's heard of refractory ceramic fibers? Refractory ceramic fibers is a non-crystalline aluminum silicate fiber that's man-made, and it's used in high temperature heat applications. It's an asbestos substitute. This falls into the fiberglass mineral wool category, but this is a very specialized fiber. It's used in the aircraft industry, it's used in kilns, it's used in the electric industry to line the boilers and things along those lines. The difference on this is it's non-crystalline, it's vitreous, and when it breaks, it becomes shorter and shorter. it doesn't get thinner and thinner, okay? So from a pathophysiology perspective, it's going to behave a little bit differently in the lung. Remember what this looked like? Long, thin, and when it divides, it gets thinner and thinner. This doesn't get shorter and shorter, this gets thinner and thinner. RCF gets shorter and shorter. And it's also non-crystalline. So we have other longitudinal studies that are still ongoing. One is refractory ceramic fibers, and we've been following this population since 1987, I think, 1987. And in fact, we are seeing that this particular fiber does cause pleural changes. It does cause pleural plaques, okay? And this is sort of the trend with that particular population. But even though we're seeing pleural plaques, we're not seeing to the extent that we're seeing it with Libby amphibole asbestos exposure. Because when you inhale one RCF fiber, it's very biopersistent in the human lung. We actually have lung data on some of the workers we follow. When they expired, they got their lungs donated to us, and we've actually found in the fiber in their lung 20 years after the last exposure. So it is persistent in human lung tissue. But the dose to the lung is lower than you see with Libby amphibole because it doesn't divide into thinner and thinner fibers. It gets shorter and shorter, and eventually it can be cleared. Okay, different pathophysiology. So in order to make this comparison realistically, on a realistic basis, we just looked at RCF people that had 30-year latency. To make it, really an objective look of a comparison basis, if everybody from the Libby amphibole cohort is 30 years out from last exposure, we should compare them to people that are 30 years out from last exposure, okay? And that's what we did here. And you can see that if we do that, RCF gets closer to what you see with Libby amphibole, but it's not there yet. One update on the RCF population, we're still following that population. We don't see interstitial fibrosis in that population at this point. Based on the data, the industry has really lowered the values down to approach the asbestos standard at current time. But we did just identify one mesothelioma in the population. And the SMRs for that are not significant, but when you ever have a mesothelioma, your ears sort of prick up a little bit. So what else is going on in the Marysville cohort? This cohort with Libby amphibole exposure. We have 2 workers who died from mesothelioma. SMRs are elevated. We were able to calculate their total fiber CC years exposure, and it was 44 fiber CC years. So these 2 workers had substantial exposure. But we just had another worker died after the 2012 publication, and they only had a 6.0 fiber CC year exposure. So his exposure was relatively smaller. Now, if you go out to Libby, Montana and look at that population, there's a marked increase in rate of mesothelioma in the workers. There's an increased mesothelioma rate in the citizens of Libby, Montana. And the EPA has spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to remediate that particular environment. And they're still in the process of doing that. What else? Well, in Libby, in a study that was published by Nieman, Kurt Nieman et al., autoimmune disease that was reported in the population was 6.8%. In Marysville, we're seeing a 9.23% as reported. So we're currently involved with taking our biological samples and comparing them to other populations that we have to see if we can actually find markers of autoimmune diseases, comparing the Marysville cohort to non-asbestos form cohorts. So there may be some indication that this particular fiber may be associated with also additional autoimmune diseases. Okay, so our conclusions were that Libby amphibole was associated with malignant, non-malignant respiratory morbidity and mortality. Historically, that was associated with what we saw in the past with commercial asbestos exposure. You have pleural changes and you get mesothelioma. They can occur at low cumulative fiber levels. This ore was distributed throughout the U.S. for both commercial applications and residential installation. And there are studies that indicate that if you have vermiculite attic insulation, it can be associated with ample fiber exposure ranging from 0.01 to 0.4 fibers per cc of air during any 30-minute remodeling activity. Okay, so go back to our dose-response relationship, 0.4 fiber cc year. At that level, we saw pleural changes. If you were exposed to that level for a few months. So our conclusions then were, what has happened is there's a federal health warnings were issued, and then Libby had declared a public health emergency. And through that, then the EPA Integrated Risk Information Systems, or IRIS, they did an assessment of Libby amphibole asbestos. And when they do this type of assessment, what they do is they review and analyze the experimental animal and human epidemiology studies. So they go back through the literature and they analyze this material. Then they do a toxicity value for cancers. What they usually do is a cancer toxicity value, which was done by NIOSH in West Virginia. And then they did a non-cancer risk assessment, or RFC, based on the workers in Marysville, Ohio. And the endpoint they were looking at that endpoint, was pleural changes. Or so they did a cancer risk assessment and they did a non-cancer risk assessment. In order for the reference concentration, that's what RFC stands for, they did this toxicology review in 2014. They did this out of Region 8 in Denver, Colorado. And they focused on localized pleural thickening, LPT. They picked that because they felt that was the first effect that you can see with low-level asbestos-borne fiber exposure. And they felt it was a relatively mild adverse outcome. But their goal was to protect the public from more serious effects, okay? So a plaque represents that, one, you've been dosed, the fiber's in your lung. Two, it's made its way to the pleural membrane to cause fibrosis along that pleural membrane. And three, if the fiber's getting to the pleural membrane, the cancer associated with fibers getting the pleural membrane is mesothelioma, okay? And that is a fatal disease. And their other decision, the way they make a decision about this is they look at what the data set looks like. Is it a vigorous data set? What kind of modeling was used based on that data set? And what kind of variables? How did they handle the variables in the model? So for those who aren't familiar with this system, this is what it is. IRIS, this is Integrated Risk Information System. And they're looking for a reference concentration. And I'll let you read this. I'll read it to you, but read it along with me. The reference concentration is an estimate with uncertainty spanning perhaps an order of magnitude of a continuous inhalational exposure to the human population, including sensitive subgroups, that means kids or elderly, that is likely to be without an appreciable risk or deleterious effect during a lifetime up to age 70. The RCF considers toxic effects for both the respiratory system, which is the port of entry, and effects for periphery to the respiratory system, or extra respiratory effects, not particular in this case. The inhalation reference concentration, generally expressed in units of milligrams per cubic meters, is analogous to the oral reference dose. It is similarly intended for use in risk assessments for health effects known or soon to be produced through a nonlinear mode of action. So it's a fairly complex application. But what the bottom line is, what they're looking at is not a working population, but a non-working population. Okay? What is the reference concentration for me to live around this particular material in the air 24 hours a day up to age 70? That's what the EPA is looking at. So based on the data, this is the reference concentration. Now the OSHA concentration is 0.1 fiber per cc. The reference concentration is 0.000001 0 fibers per cc. Okay. It is an extremely low reference concentration. Okay. Oh, something happened there. Okay, so this was a multidisciplinary approach. So when you take your epidemiology, you take your statistics, and you take your public health studies, take them seriously. Because the reason we were able to do this is that it wasn't Jim Lockey. I was the MD part of this. We had good statisticians. We have very good project coordinators who are out there, telling me what I need to do, when I need to do it, and how I need to stay on time. We have a great industrial hygienist. We have great epidemiologists, and really it was a team approach. And Jerbeck was with the EPA. Dr. Lemancer's in epidemiology. Permy, Myers, Shipley are all chest radiologists. McKay is a pulmonary toxicologist. Rice is an excellent industrial hygienist. Statistician, project coordinator, epidemiologist. We take a team approach to it, okay? The strength of this study is it's a longitudinal study. We kept this population, we kept the files, we look at them over time. And when you do that, everybody who's in the study, they become their own control. You're comparing Jim Lockey in 1980 to Jim Lockey in 1990 to Jim Lockey in 2010. I become my own control. And that is a very powerful way to look at a population over time. So what's happening now? Well, the USGS just came out with an instrument that now you can sample whether the insulation in your wall is Libby amphibole asbestos. Because there's over 25 million to 30 million homes in the US that have this insulation in their walls. The trouble is this instrument costs about $50,000. Okay, I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm going to go on to a little bit about the Rocky Mountain Center. This is what the skyline of Salt Lake City looked like when I was out here. It looks a little different now when I look over the skyline, but this is downtown. There is actually snow in the background. There wasn't much haze on this particular day, but this is what it looked like when I was here in 1980. Anybody know what this is? Go. Oh, what's that?
Spontaneous combustion from a hay bale.
Pretty close, yeah, it's very good. This is in Fillmore, Utah. Anybody know what's in Fillmore, Utah? Mushroom plant, that's right. So when I was here, we did health hazard evaluations with NIOSH. And Bobby Gunner was involved with this. He worked at NIOSH, and he came down, and we were down there looking at the mushroom plant. And this is what they use as their growing medium in Fillmore, Utah. And the plant's still down there. I was down there about a year ago, going down to someplace south, and I stopped at Fillmore, Utah to see if the mushroom plant was still there, and the mushroom plant's still there. The interesting thing about that study, when we looked at the workers, there were 6 different languages being spoken in that particular population. It made the human health data very difficult to evaluate because we weren't sure we were getting the answers that really we needed. We had translators, we weren't quite sure about that. This is where in Utah? It's, everybody here, Gilsonite? Anybody, Gilsonite? Who said Gilsonite? You got it, yeah. Yeah, it's Gilsonite. Have you been there? Yeah. It's fascinating. Have you been in mine? It's the most unique mine I've ever been in my whole life. It's Gilsonite's used as a, you put this stuff on your driveway to make it black. It's a particulate, it's a hydrocarbon, but it's lighter than coal and almost floats on water. And the Gilsonite seam doesn't run horizontal on the ground, it runs vertical. And it runs for, what, miles, I guess. What's that? That's petrified oil, exactly right. And when they mine it, they go down and build scaffolding down as they're mining it. It's just a fascinating mine. If you ever get a chance, I wonder if they wouldn't take your students on a tour. It is absolutely fascinating mining. It's very explosive, so they don't use any type of, it's all air-driven drills that are used in the mine because it's very explosive when it's airborne. Okay, where's this? This is 1985. What happened in 1985 in Utah? None of you were probably born then. Some of you were born, yeah. What's what? At Price? Yeah, Price, Utah. So this is what? What kind of mining machine is this? That's a Longwall, right? Longwall machine. Longwall is there's a blade that goes along here, shears off the longwall, falls down on a conveyor belt. This is when I was in Utah. I had 2 residents with me then. A week later, they had the fire in this mine, and what had happened was the ventilation stream, the air stream was coming this way, and the mine fire started in a conveyor belt, and the CO was brought across the face of the mine, knocked all the miners down. Okay, how many people died in that? You number 26? 27, yeah. That's a longwall machine. I've never seen a longwall machine. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's just one big. These are sort of robotic units, and as it cuts through the wall, it just this thing which is almost a block to 2 blocks long, just sort of crawls through the mountain. It is absolutely a fascinating mining technique. Virginia Aldrich. Does anybody remember Virginia? She was my PA, and she just was incredible. I think she still lives in Salt Lake City. This is Howard Nieman. I don't know if he's still in Salt Lake City or not. He was a resident. Sharon Smith was the administrator. That's Virginia. And I somewhat presentable in that slide. And this is we're back at the Gilsonite mine, and this was Howard and Virginia, and they were about to moon me on as they were running away from me. I didn't take a picture of that. I just took a picture of this. So this is what I looked at in Cincinnati in 1980. I had my hair frizzed. I mean, I really wasn't that presentable. And this is outside Marysville plant, and we had a trailer that we would take around, and the workers would come through the trailer. And when I came to Utah, I became much more mature. I didn't have the curly hair. This is a mine rescue unit. This was before we went down the mine with some faculty and students. And when I left Utah, they had a party for me, and this was sort of a reflection. They survived Jim Lockey as I went on to Cincinnati from that point. So my bottom line is, it's a great field to be in. Think about longitudinal databases. If you've developed a database as a grad student, see if you can hold on to it. In case you ever go into academics, you can relook at the population at some point in the future. And you can make an impact. You really can make an impact on public health. You can make an impact on both from an environmental and an occupational perspective, especially if you have good data. And always approach it as a team. It has to be approached as a team approach, because that's what we're in. I'm not a good epidemiologist. I can speak the language, but I wouldn't call myself an epidemiologist. I can do some statistics, but I would never call myself a statistician. I know something about industrial hygiene, but I would never call myself an industrial hygienist. Okay? You bring those people in with you, and you do it as a team. Any questions? Yes?
As far as the host rock is concerned for the Libby Vermiculite?
I'm sorry, say again?
So the host rock for the Libby Vermiculite?
Yes.
That was the medium for the asbestos, is that correct?
The vermiculite ore source in Libby had additional mineral sources that ran with the vermiculite ore. And that additional mineral sources was that richterite, windsite, asbestos-formed mineral.
Okay.
okay? So when they would mine it, they couldn't separate the two. They tried to separate it in the processing, during the processing and milling process, but they could never really separate it. And when we were here at the university, when I was out here through the VA, we take the expanded ore and we do electron micron scanning, and you can see the fibers sitting on the expanded ore. So it was carried, even in the expanded form, it was carried through. Yes?
Can you look at the fiberglass industry as well as the RFC?
We did look at the question is, did we look at the fiberglass industry? And we did look at the fiberglass. Fiberglass, most fiberglass is non-respirable, some specialty glass fibers. And most fiberglass is very soluble in the lung. You look in the lung, 30 to 60 days later, it disappears. It has a very high solubility factor. Now, there is some very specialty glass fibers that are very small and are respirable and are durable, all right? But I haven't looked at them. I've just looked at the larger fiberglass in character. Other question? Yes?
To follow up on the students that were on the vermiculite, what percent you said? You said 26%?
Up to 26%, depending on what. Yeah.
And then in the ore, when it was expanded, is that?
That would drop down. It would drop down to anywhere from 1% to 5%, depending on, it all depends on what part of the mine they were in at one particular time and how much contamination, I don't want to say it's contamination because it wasn't, it was part of the ore source and how much of that asbestos-formed mineral was with the micaceous mineral when they were mining that particular area.
And when it expands, does it retain the same percent?
No, it drops. It drops down. But you can see the fibers on the expanded part of it. It just sort of sits on the surface. It's rather amazing.
Second question is, you mentioned it was in animal feed and also used on the lawn for stuff.
Yeah, the question is, what happens when you put it on the lawns? Well, with Scott, we were concerned about that. So we had them, with the old ore that was impregnated with fertilizers, we actually followed them around when they were putting it on the lawn. We couldn't identify any fibers. Once it was impregnated with that herbicide or fertilizer, it sort of became encapsulated and we couldn't see it. We never found any fibers that were airborne after you put it on the lawn. The other question was? Animal feed. I just know that vermiculite's been used as a filler in animal feed. I can't tell you any more than that. Okay. Yes?
Do the other sources of vermiculite across the world have similar issues, or is it just specific to Libby?
Well, interesting question. In Virginia, they have what they call massive, they have tremolite, but it's more of a massive type cleavage fragment like tremolite. And there's a big controversy in the mineralogy industry as well, field as well as the medical field, whether the short, squatty cleavage fragments have the same health effect as the long, thin fibers. My perspective is avoid it, because I don't think the data is in on that. And I take a public health perspective. Until it's proven otherwise, avoid it. Okay, generally. Yes?
Thank you. I was curious if you'd be willing to share your thoughts on kind of the policy and how to recognize these things. Given the ubiquity of vermiculite in residential structures and commercial, what could we have done to see that sooner, or to recognize that issue and how it's going to be?
Well, it's sort of like everything else. It takes time to. Something happens, all of a sudden something bubbles to the top of the heap and everybody starts to recognize it, and then they say, well, why didn't we recognize it 20 years ago when it was first brought out in the medical literature as potential hazard? I think social media is a way to do that, but then you can also cause a panic if you do something and you don't have good data, right? So that, I'm not sure that's the proper approach. What we've done is now, like with diacetyl, we presented that at a scientific meeting almost immediately, right? Even though we did that and we did a press conference, it wasn't well recognized until a number of years later. It just seems to be a lag period between when a public health hazard is identified and when it becomes of concern. And what's the proper approach? Just stay with it. Keep presenting the data. Keep raising the issue. Like we're raising the issue of ultrafines. I think ultrafines. Somebody is looking. I think ultrafines is a real public health hazard. I have a lot of reasons I think that, I have a conflict because we're producing the sensor, but we're producing the sensor because we were so concerned about ultrafines and the study we're doing in Cincinnati. All right. So if I tell you that there's a human study out there from Edinburgh, England, where they had men inhale ultrafines who were going to have elective surgery on their carotid arteries, right? I don't know how they got that through the IRB, but the surgery was going to be done anyway because they had obstruction. So the day before surgery, they had them inhale 30 nanometer gold nanoparticulates. Gold is inert. We use gold for rheumatoid arthritis in humans. And they identified it in the bloodstream the next day and in the urine 3 months later. Okay? So when I think about that, I think, well, there's no question it gets through the alveolar capillary membrane. It's no question it's distributed systemically. It's no question that it's probably getting the central nervous system. So what's the impact of ultrafine exposure from motor vehicle exhaust over your lifetime in relationship to our mental capacity at age 60, 70, and 80? You know, maybe we really can live to 120. You know, I don't know the answer to that. So we raised the issues, you know, keep pushing forward. Hi.
So, was your data ever used in a class action lawsuit? If so, were you called as a...
That's a great question. How'd you know that? That's a great question. It is a great question. Yeah, the executives of WR Grace were prosecuted by the federal government, criminal prosecution. And I was an expert witness for the federal government. But they lost the case. The feds lost the case. So in a certain respect, that took place a number of years ago. So I guess, but that happened after I'd done the research. So I didn't have a I announced that when I published papers that I did that I worked for the federal government in that prosecution. But and our data was used. But the WR Grace had about 20 attorneys in the courtroom. And there was one federal prosecutor and a few witnesses, and that was it. I think, yeah, not a lot of resources were put into the whole process, and that's a reach. You know, putting executives on trial for something like that is pushing the envelope, perhaps. But there was some data available that they knew back in the 70s that this was a potential hazard and chose not to reveal it. Yeah, so. I think your Paul Richards wouldn't have ever done something like that. Yes?
What was your funding stream over these years? I mean, it seems to me that's the kind of the catch-all. Why aren't we following this across? Because we only had funding for 2 years, and then we tried to find funding for another year, and another year, and another year.
Well, in relationship to this, the original funding was the company, all right? And then what happened was we approached, because we knew what was going on in Libby, Montana, the CDC approached us to said, would you be willing to relook at the Marysville cohort again? And we wrote a grant and then we got funded through the CDC. And then the next one was for the EPA, because they were interested in putting together an RFC on this. And they said, can you look at the population again? So that's how we did that. But when I left Cincinnati in 1980, all these records were stored in filing cabinets in the base of Kettering, right? And I put a big note on it. I don't know how I thought about it. Do not destroy, Dr. Lockey. Even though I was out here, I had that note on the filing cabinet. So I went back, and they were still there. Nobody had touched them in, 6 or 7 years. They weren't touched. So I was able to do that. Now, relationship to the refractory ceramic fiber population, that's an industry-sponsored study, all right? And the funding, we convinced them that this may be a potential other asbestos. You need to follow this population forever, essentially, and that's what they're doing. So that in relationship to the study we're doing in kids in Cincinnati, we've been following them for newborns up to age 13, and they're still being followed. That's funded through NIEHS. That's an NIEHS funded study. Yes? I'm sorry, say again?
The relationship between the autoimmune
yes.
and the cancer.
Yes.
Do you know what those numbers? Or?
The question is, how good is our autoimmune data? What do we know about that? Kurt Nieman is studying the Libby Montana population in relationship to that now, and we're using the Marysville study as a comparison population. Our study has better exposure data than they have from Libby Montana. Those results aren't available yet. All right, they're not available. Is there going to be an autoimmune abnormality associated with this particular fiber? It's a very reactive fiber because it has a high iron content, and it causes a lot of oxidative stress. So I don't know the answer whether it's going to be associated with autoimmune disease or not. If it gets, the pleural membrane is pleurisy is a component of certain autoimmune diseases, okay? So if somebody has lupus, they can develop pleuritic chest pain. Somebody has rheumatoid arthritis, they can develop pleuritic chest pain and pleural effusions. So it sort of fits into that category, but whether in fact it's established or not, I don't know the answer. One more, yeah.
Just curious if you have any insight or an opinion on the Johnson & Johnson. And
Oh boy,
powder.
yeah. Johnson & Johnson is, all right, so talc. Governor's Talc District of New York has asbestos for mineral contamination. Some of it is cleavage fragments, okay, and some of it is long, thin fibers. If you go back to the historical medical literature, there's something called a talc fiber. In fact, fiber-associated talc. I think Johnson & Johnson is in a difficult situation. I haven't gone back and looked at them and figured out when did they switch ore sources, how much asbestos form. They said less than 1%. Well, less than 1% may not be, based on current data, enough. But I did, back in the 80s, publish a book chapter in one of the preliminary occupational textbooks. And in that chapter, there's a case report of ovarian cancer and talc fibers in the ovary. So, I don't know the answer, but I follow it just because it's a high profile. It's high profile, no question.
Dr. Lockey, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And to memorialize.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, one more.